Hello, and welcome to Lyla's Lullabies, where we spend time exploring with Lyla, a traveler who wanders the world at her own pace, while sharing her most enriching and restorative moments with you. In tonight's story, we'll follow Lyla as she explores the enduring city of Bologna in Italy. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to remember. Just settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself go. We're so glad you're here. Whenever you're ready, let's begin. The train pulled into Bologna Centrale just after 9 in the morning, its brakes hissing as it came to a smooth stop. Lyla gathered her day bag and stepped onto the platform, joining the flow of passengers making their way toward the station exit. March in Bologna was cool but pleasant, the air carrying a crispness that spoke of winter's recent departure without yet promising spring's full arrival. She'd left her luggage at her hotel in Florence, planning to return that evening. Bologna was a day trip, a city she'd been curious about for years but had somehow never visited. Known for its food, its university, its medieval towers and endless porticos, Bologna had a reputation for being authentically Italian in a way that tourist-heavy cities sometimes weren't. The walk from the station to the city center took about 20 minutes, leading her through gradually narrowing streets as the architecture shifted from the utilitarian to the historic. The buildings were painted in shades of terracotta, ochre, and burnt sienna, the colors that had given Bologna its nickname, La Rosa, the Red One. The porticos began here, covered walkways, supported by arched columns that lined nearly every street, creating shaded corridors even on the sunniest days. Lyla found herself drawn forward by the porticos, following their lead like a river following its banks. She passed shops just opening for the day, cafes where locals stood at the bar drinking espresso, a newsstand where an elderly man was arranging the morning papers. The city had a lived-in quality, a sense of ongoing daily life that tourists passed through but didn't define. The porticos opened suddenly onto Piazza Maggiore, and Lyla paused at the edge of the square to take it in. The piazza was vast and irregular, its open space surrounded by medieval and Renaissance buildings that seemed to lean in slightly, as if protecting the square from the outside world. At the southern end stood the Basilica di San Petronio, its facade unfinished, the lower portion covered in marble, the upper portion bare brick, as if the builders had simply stopped mid-project and never returned. It was early enough that the square wasn't yet crowded. A few pigeons pecked at the cobblestones, and an older woman crossed the piazza with a shopping bag, her footsteps echoing slightly in the morning quiet. Lyla walked toward the basilica, admiring the way the sunlight caught the marble of the lower facade, making it glow against the red brick above. Inside, the basilica was enormous and austere, its vastness emphasized by the relative simplicity of its decoration. The ceiling soared overhead, supported by massive columns. Light filtered through stained glass windows, creating pools of colored light on the stone floor. Lyla walked slowly down the nave, her footsteps quiet, occasionally pausing to examine a side chapel or a piece of articolo. In one chapel she found a meridian line, a brass strip set into the floor, with markings for the calendar, with a small hole in the ceiling that allowed sunlight to strike the line at solar noon. It was a scientific instrument built into a church, a reminder of Bologna's long intellectual history. Back outside, she crossed the piazza toward the Palazzo da Corso, the medieval palace that now served as city hall. The building's facade was elegant and imposing, with arched windows and a clock tower rising from one corner. A bronze statue of Pope Gregory XIII stood above the entrance, the Bologna-born pope who had reformed the calendar that most of the world still used. Lyla continued exploring the square's perimeter, finding small side streets that led to quieter corners. She discovered a tiny bookshop tucked under a portico, its window display showing old leather-bound volumes and contemporary Italian literature. Inside, the shop was cramped and fragrant with old paper. The owner, a man with reading glasses perched on the head, looked up from the desk and nodded a greeting. "Buongiorno," Lyla said. "Buongiorno," he replied, returning to work. Some kind of cataloging, she thought, watching him make notes in a ledger. She browsed for a few minutes, running her fingers along book spines, admiring editions in Italian, French, and Latin. She wasn't looking for anything particular, just enjoying the atmosphere of the shop, the sense of time moving slowly among these accumulated words. Leaving the bookshop, she made her way toward the two towers, Bologna's most iconic landmarks. The towers were visible from various points in the city center, rising above the surrounding buildings like exclamation points. As she got closer, their true scale became apparent. Tall, narrow medieval towers built by noble families as symbols of power and prestige. The taller of the two, Torre degli Asinelli, leaned slightly, its brick facade weathered by centuries. The shorter one, Torre Garisenda, leaned even more dramatically, its tilt more pronounced than Pisa's famous tower, though far less celebrated. Both towers stood in a small piazza where several streets converged, creating a kind of medieval intersection. Lyla had decided to climb the Asinelli Tower, and she paid her entrance fee and began the ascent. The stairway was wooden and narrow, winding upward through the tower's hollow interior. The steps were worn smooth by countless feet, and the climb was steep enough that she had to pace herself, pausing occasionally at small windows that looked out over the city. Other climbers passed her going down, a family with children, a couple speaking German, a solo traveler like herself who nodded in acknowledgement as they squeezed past each other on the narrow stairs. The view from the top was worth the effort. Bologna spread out in all directions, a sea of terracotta roofs, punctuated by church domes and the occasional tower. The porticos were visible from here, creating linear shadows through the streets. To the south, she could see the hills rising beyond the city, their slopes dotted with villas and cypress trees. The wind was stronger up here, cool and fresh, and Lyla stood at the railing taking in the panorama. She could trace the route she'd walked from the station, identify the bulk of San Petronio in Piazza Maggiore, spot other landmarks she'd read about, but hadn't yet visited. The city looked both compact and complex from this height, its medieval street plan evident in the irregular patterns of buildings and squares. After descending, easier on the lungs but harder on the knees, Lyla set out to explore the porticos more thoroughly. Bologna had more porticos than any other city in the world, she'd read, over 40 kilometers of covered walkways that allowed residents to move through the city while protected from sun and rain. She chose a direction at random and began walking, letting the porticos guide her. Some were grand and elegant, with high ceilings and decorative columns. Others were simpler, more functional, their arches rough and unadorned, but they all created the same effect, a sense of being both inside and outside. sheltered but not enclosed. The porticoes passed shops and cafes, residential buildings and churches, creating a continuous covered corridor that made the city feel intimate and connected. Lyla passed a woman sweeping the pavement in front of her shop, the broom's bristles making soft scratching sounds. She passed a group of university students arguing animated ly about something, their voices echoing under the arches. She passed an elderly man walking a small dog, both of them moving at a pace that suggested they'd walked this same route 1,000 times before. At one point, the portico opened onto a small, unexpected courtyard, a hidden gem tucked away from the main streets. A fountain stood at the center, water trickling from a lion's mouth into a worn stone basin. Potted plants lined the edges, and a cat sat on a windowsill watching Lyla with calm indifference. It was the kind of space you'd never find if you were following a map, the kind of discovery that made wandering worthwhile. By now it was nearly lunchtime, and Lyla's thoughts were turning decidedly toward food. She'd come to Bologna partly for its cuisine. This was, after all, the city that had given the world ragù, tortellini, mortadella, and Parmigiano-Reggiano. She'd asked the bookshop owner earlier for a lunch recommendation, and he'd written down an address on a scrap of paper, saying simply, "Tradizionale, molto buono." She found the restaurant down a side street, its entrance marked only by a small brass plaque and a handwritten menu in the window. Inside, the space was compact and unpretentious, marble-topped tables, bentwood chairs, walls decorated with old photographs of Bologna. It was full of locals, which Lyla took as a very good sign. The server, a woman in her 50s with her hair pulled back in a practical bun, approached with a menu and a basket of fresh bread. "Buongiorno," Lyla said. "Un tavolo per una persona?" "Certo, si accomodi," the woman replied, gesturing to a small table near the window. Lyla studied the menu, which was entirely in Italian with no translations, another good sign. She recognized most of the dishes: tagliatelle al ragù, tortellini in brodo, lasagne, gramigna con salsiccia. The server returned, and Lyla ordered the tagliatelle and a glass of red wine. "Ottima scelta," the woman said with an approving nod. "Excellent choice." The pasta arrived after a short wait, and Lyla understood immediately why Bologna was famous for its food. The tagliatelle was fresh and delicate, cut to the traditional width that allowed it to hold the ragù perfectly. The sauce itself was rich and complex. Beef and pork simmered for hours with tomato, wine, and aromatics, creating something that bore little resemblance to the Bolognese sauce served in restaurants elsewhere. She ate slowly, savoring each forkful, occasionally pausing to sip her wine or tear off a piece of bread to wipe the plate. Around her, other diners were doing the same, the restaurant filled with the sounds of quiet satisfaction, the clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation, the occasional exclamation of pleasure at a particularly good bite. When she finished, the server cleared her plate and asked if she wanted dessert. Lyla ordered a coffee instead, and it arrived in a small cup, strong and perfect. She drank it slowly, feeling the pleasant fullness that came from a meal well chosen and well prepared. "Com'era?" the server asked when she brought the bill. "Squisito," Lyla replied. "Grazie mille." The woman smiled, pleased. "Di niente, torni presto." Outside, Lyla felt content and energized, despite the substantial lunch. The afternoon was mild, and she decided to continue exploring on foot. Her next destination was the Basilica di Santo Stefano, a complex of religious buildings known as the Seven Churches, though fewer than 7 buildings actually remained. The walk took her through quieter streets, away from the main tourist routes. She passed workshops where artisans still practiced traditional crafts, a furniture restorer, a bookbinder, a shop specializing in handmade pasta molds. Through open doors, she glimpsed people at work, focused and unhurried, practicing skills passed down through generations. Santo Stefano stood in its own piazza, a collection of interconnected buildings in brick and stone, their ages and styles varying, but somehow cohesive. Lyla entered through the main church and found herself in a space that felt ancient and layered, each building opening into the next, creating a maze of chapels, courtyards, and quiet corners. In one courtyard, a well stood at the center, its basin worn smooth by centuries of use. The cloister was peaceful, its columns casting striped shadows across the pavement. Lyla sat on a stone bench and listened to the silence, broken only by the distant sound of church bells and the cooing of pigeons somewhere overhead. From Santo Stefano, she made her way to the Archiginnasio, the historic seat of the University of Bologna, the oldest university in the Western world, founded in 1888. The building's interior was spectacular, its walls covered in elaborate heraldic decorations, coats of arms of students and professors accumulated over centuries. The highlight was the anatomical theater, a small wooden amphitheater where medical students once observed dissections. The room was all carved wood, tiered seating arranged around a central marble table, the ceiling decorated with figures representing famous physicians. At the center, beneath an elaborate canopy, was where the bodies would have been placed for study. It was fascinating and slightly macabre, a reminder of how knowledge had been pursued, even when such pursuits were controversial or forbidden. Lyla stood in the small space, imagining students crowded on the benches, leaning forward to observe, to learn, to understand the workings of the human body. After the Archiginnasio, she walked to the Quadrilatero, the market district that had been the commercial heart of Bologna for centuries. The neighborhood was a maze of narrow streets, each one specialized in particular goods. There was a street for fishmongers, another for butchers, another for produce vendors. The Via Pescieri Vesci was particularly atmospheric, its stalls displaying seafood on beds of ice, despite Bologna being landlocked, a testament to Italy's excellent logistics and the enduring demand for fresh fish. Lyla wandered through the market streets, admiring displays of vegetables she didn't recognize, hanging salumi in every variety, wheels of Parmigiano-Reggiano stacked like ancient columns. Shop owners called out to customers, negotiated prices, wrapped purchases in brown paper with practiced efficiency. At one cheese shop, the vendor was offering samples of different Parmigiano-Reggiano ages, 12 months, 24 months, 36 months. Lyla tried a piece of the 36-month, and the flavor was extraordinary, crystalline and complex, nutty and sweet and savory all at once. È incredibile, she said to the vendor, an older man with a white apron. Sì, he agreed, nodding with pride. Questo è il vero parmigiano. Non quello che vendono al supermercato. His pride that this was the real stuff was evident. He wrapped a small wedge for her, refusing to let her leave without buying some, and she tucked it into her bag, already imagining how she'd enjoy it later. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, Lyla decided to make her way to the Sanctuary of the Madonna di San Luca, a hilltop basilica that overlooked Bologna from the southwest. The sanctuary was connected to the city by the world's longest portico, nearly 4 kilometers of covered archway climbing up the hillside. She caught a taxi at Piazza Maggiore, and the driver, a cheerful man about 60, navigated the narrow streets with the confidence of someone who'd driven them for decades. They left the city center and began climbing the hill, the road winding upward through residential neighborhoods that gradually gave way to more rural landscapes. Prima volta a Bologna? He asked, glancing at her in the rear-view mirror. First time in Bologna? Sì, Lyla replied. È una città bellissima. È la migliore in Italia, he said with local pride. Lei è stata al santuario prima? No, è la prima volta. Bene, bene. La vista è magnifica. Può vedere tutta la città, tutte le colline, he said, gesturing to the magnificent view, hills in all directions. He dropped her at the sanctuary's entrance, refusing her tip with a wave of his hand. Buona serata, signora. Si goda la vista. The sanctuary itself was impressive, a Baroque church with a distinctive oval plan, its interior ornate with frescoes and gold decoration. But it was the view that truly captured Lyla's attention. From the terrace in front of the church, Bologna spread out below, the city's red roofs glowing in the late afternoon light. The two towers were visible, the dome of San Petronio, the hills beyond fading into the distance. After exploring the sanctuary, Lyla began her descent on foot, walking down through the endless portico. The archways created a rhythm as she walked, each one framing a view of the hillside, the next section of portico, or occasionally a glimpse of the city below. The portico was painted in warm colors, ochre and terracotta, and the late afternoon light made everything glow. The walk down was meditative, the repetition of arches creating a kind of moving meditation. She passed the occasional other walker, mostly locals out for evening exercise, and a few pilgrims making the climb upward. Every so often, there were small shrines or chapels built into the portico, places to stop and rest or pray. Lyla walked slowly, in no hurry, enjoying the gradual descent and the changing views. As she got closer to the city, the landscape shifted from rural to suburban to urban, but the portico remained constant, its arches continuing their steady march downward. By the time she reached the city center, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The porticos of Bologna glowed in the evening light, and the city had settled into its early evening rhythm, shops closing, restaurants opening, people emerging for the passeggiata, that Italian tradition of the evening stroll. Lyla joined the flow of people moving through the streets, no longer following any particular route, just walking and observing. The city felt different now, softer somehow, the day's sharp edges smoothed by the fading light. Couples walked arm in arm, families with children moved toward restaurants, groups of students gathered in piazzas, their laughter carrying through the evening air. She found herself back in Piazza Maggiore, which had transformed since morning. The square was busy now, but not frantic, people sitting on the steps of San Petronio, others standing in small groups talking, a street musician playing accordion near the fountain. The buildings around the square were illuminated, their facades warm and golden against the darkening sky. Lyla found a spot on the steps and sat down, letting the scene unfold around her. She thought about the day, the climb up the Asinelli Tower, the winding exploration of the porticoes, the perfect lunch, the peaceful courtyard at Santo Stefano, the anatomical theatre's strange beauty, the vibrant market streets, the hilltop sanctuary, and the long walk down through the covered archways. Bologna had been everything she'd hoped and more: historic without being frozen in the past, beautiful without being precious, authentic in a way that felt increasingly rare. The city had revealed itself gradually, through small discoveries and quiet moments, through conversations in Italian and wandering without maps, through food that tasted of tradition and streets that carried the weight of centuries. The accordion player shifted to a new tune, something classical and melancholy, and the notes drifted across the square. Lyla closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her, mixing with the murmur of voices and the distant chime of church bells. She knew she'd have to leave soon, catch the train back to Florence, return to the trajectory of her larger journey, but for now, she was content to sit on these steps in this square in this city, feeling the stones still warm from the day's sun, listening to the accordion and the voices and the evening sounds of Bologna settling into night. The light continued to fade, the sky deepening from pink to purple to the first hints of star-dusted darkness. People continued to move through the square, each on their own trajectory, all of them part of the city's ongoing story. And Lyla sat among them, a temporary visitor becoming briefly part of that story, grateful for the day, content with the moment, at peace in the gentle evening light.